So you think you've had a rough week? Try giving birth on a dirt floor. No doctor, no anesthesia. Just you, some boiled water, and a screaming baby while your husband's out hunting coyotes or dead in a ditch. Try being 19 with 5 kids already. Cooking 3 meals a day over open flame. Fetching water from a frozen stream. Hauling wood. Plowing soil. Sewing clothes. Fighting off rats. And praying your roof doesn't cave in tonight. Now imagine doing all that while being legally considered less than a cow. The Wild West, gold, grit, and guns was built on the backs of women no one talks about. History loves the cowboys, the sheriffs, the bandits, but it forgets the ones who did the laundry, buried the babies, and cleaned up the blood. The Wild West has always been told as a man's story. Cowboys ride into sunsets. Bandits rob trains. Sheriffs duel at high noon. And the saloon girls in the background, they smile pretty and pour the whiskey, but they never speak. They never struggle. They never survive anything real. They're scenery. But that story is a lie, or at best, half the truth. Behind every dusty legend of outlaws and lawmen was a woman who didn't get a say in how the West was written. She was too busy scraping together meals, giving birth in the back of a wagon, or burying another child lost to disease. While men made history, women were surviving it. This isn't a tale of gunfights and gold rushes. It's about what the history books left out: the millions of women who were dragged across mountains and deserts, whose names we'll never know, and whose suffering never made it into the cowboy songs. Women who were promised land and freedom, but were handed back-breaking labor and lives filled with silence. The Wild West wasn't just untamed, it was unfair. And for women, it was a daily war no one came to rescue them from. So, before we chase cattle, pan for gold, or carve out homesteads, we need to do something else. Tell the real story. No country for women. Forget the postcard version of the West Cowboys' tipping hats, golden sunsets, the glint of gold in a miner's pan. The reality was harsher, and for women, far crueler. In the 1800s, the West wasn't a place so much as a gamble. People left the East not for adventure, but because there was nowhere else to go. Economic collapse, war, famine, whatever had pushed them out, the frontier didn't care who they were. For women, the move west stripped away even the meager protections they'd had back east. Out here, law was thin, churches sparse, and hospitals non-existent. Some boomtowns counted 10 men for every woman. That imbalance turned women into currency bargained for, claimed, or fought over. Picture stepping off a wagon after months of blistered feet and shallow graves along the trail, only to find men sizing you up like livestock. Many settlements openly advertised for women in Eastern newspapers. Opportunities abound, the ads promised. What they meant was, we need wives, or at least someone to cook, clean, and keep our beds warm. Once you arrived, there was no easy retreat. You were surrounded by mountains, prairie, and men who hadn't seen a woman in months. The nearest rail line might be hundreds of miles away, even if you realized you'd made a mistake. The wilderness and the cost of escape trapped you. Isolation ate away at women's spirits. Men could vanish into the next town. Women stayed raising children in one-room cabins with no neighbors for miles. Letters home took months. And if your husband turned violent, there was no sheriff rushing to your defense. In many towns, a strong man was expected to discipline his wife. It's no wonder frontier women aged fast forward. By 30, many bore the lines and stoop of 60. These were not the powdered belles of dime novels, but weather-beaten survivors with hands like rawhide. And still, more women kept coming, dragged by husbands, chasing some fragile hope, or running from an old life into an even harsher one. The West wasn't designed for women. It was a proving ground that broke most and hardened the rest. And simply stepping into it meant you'd already joined the fight. The dangerous journey west. Long before a woman faced the hardships of frontier life, she had to survive getting there. A journey as deadly as any gunfight. Most traveled not in luxury coaches, but in cramped wagons rattling over ruts worn by thousands of hooves. Inside, children, livestock, barrels of salted meat, maybe a drunken relative, and whatever meager possessions could fit. The roads were little more than scars in the earth. Every mile was a wager with your own survival. Water could be days away. Food spoiled. Dust storms tore apart canvas shelters. Sickness spread like wildfire in cramped quarters. Cholera was the silent killer. You could wake healthy and be dead by sundown, buried in a shallow grave marked only by a stick. And many women made that trip pregnant. There was no safe place to give birth. Labor might happen in the back of a swaying wagon, in mud beside a river, or in the cold shadow of a mountain pass. There was no pause. The train moved on, leaving fresh graves behind. Dangers didn't just come from the landscape. Wagon trains were far from harmonious. Drunken fights, theft, and sexual assault were grim realities, especially for unaccompanied women. Justice was whatever the most powerful man decided it was. Native resistance played its part, but far fewer settlers died in conflicts with indigenous tribes than from disease and starvation. Most tribes wanted nothing to do with the wagon trains unless provoked or trespassed upon. Still, women endured. They mended clothes by firelight, kept journals, soothed sick children, and coaxed life out of whatever scraps they had left. They pressed on not because they wanted to, but because turning back meant certain ruin. By the time a woman's wagon rolled into her new home, she wasn't the same person. The trail carved her into something harder, quieter, and infinitely more tired. And yet, the true battle was still ahead. On the frontier, marriage was less about romance and more about survival, especially for women. A woman alone faced danger at every turn. She couldn't buy land. She often couldn't travel safely. In many places, she couldn't earn enough to live on. Marriage offered protection, food, and shelter, but it also came with chains. Under the law of coverture, a married woman ceased to exist as a legal person. Her husband owned the land, the house, the wages she might earn, even the children she bore. Leaving wasn't just frowned upon, it was nearly impossible. Courts favored men, and divorces required money, witnesses, and influence most women didn't have. A violent or neglectful husband could strip away a woman's safety in an instant, but the law rarely intervened. Even good husbands were shaped by a culture that saw obedience as a wife's duty. Life inside marriage was no easier. Women worked dawn to dark, hauling water, tending fires, raising children, cooking, sewing, cleaning, feeding livestock, chopping wood. Their bodies were treated as extensions of the household economy. Birth control was scarce and often illegal. So pregnancies came one after another until health failed or life ended. Some women did find partnership and mutual respect, but they were rare exceptions. For most, marriage was the only path available, and it cost them their autonomy, their time, and often their youth. On paper, it was a contract. In practice, it was a lifetime sentence. Childbirth and death on the frontier. No hospitals, no anesthesia, no trained doctor waiting with clean instruments. Just a straw mattress, a rusted pair of scissors, maybe a neighbor who'd done this before, and a whispered prayer that you'd both live until morning. On the frontier, childbirth wasn't just painful. It was one of the most common ways a woman could die. There were no sterile tools, no antibiotics, and no pain relief beyond whiskey or biting down on a rag. Whoever attended your birth, likely a midwife, might have years of experience, or none at all. They worked with what they had: herbs, old remedies, and guesswork. If labor went wrong, breach, hemorrhage, infection, there was nothing anyone could do but watch the life drain out of you. Sometimes the child died with the mother. Sometimes the baby lived on, still nursing from a body that had already gone cold. Death was not an unwelcome stranger in frontier homes. It was a familiar, frequent guest. And survival after birth was never guaranteed. Postpartum infections thrived in cabins without clean water or washed hands. A retained placenta, untreated fever, or even a simple cut could turn septic. There was no time to heal. Most women were back to hauling water, cooking, and tending livestock within days, bleeding into rags while working. Reproduction was constant. 5, 7, even 15 births were not unusual, because women had almost no control over when or if they became pregnant. Birth control was rare, unreliable, and often illegal. Those who tried to avoid pregnancy risked being called immoral or defiant. Postpartum infections ran rampant. There were no sterile sheets, no disinfectants, no clean hands. Even something as simple as a retained placenta could lead to sepsis and kill a woman within days. And the pain? Unrelenting. Women were expected to return to work within days of giving birth, feeding animals, hauling water, and tending to other children. There was no rest, no recovery, no sympathy. Speaking of children, let's talk about how many women had 5, 7, 10, even 15 or more. Why? Because they had no control over reproduction. Birth control was limited, often illegal, and poorly understood. Condoms were rare, and women who tried to prevent pregnancy were seen as immoral or defiant. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and loss was devastating. Babies died of everything: fever, malnutrition, snake bites, drowning, infections. Some women buried multiple children before they turned 30. Imagine digging your child's grave in frozen earth while your body still bled from the last delivery. But grief had no room to grow. Life on the frontier demanded that you keep moving. You wiped your eyes and got back to churning butter or cleaning the rifle. There was no pause button for mourning. You buried your pain like you buried your children, quietly and deep. And yet, women kept giving birth by rivers, in wagons, in tents, on dirt floors, knowing full well the odds were against them. Because on the frontier, bringing life into the world meant opening the door wide for death. The labor behind the myth: women's work never ended. When the West is remembered, it's all spurs, saloons, and six-shooters. No one pictures the woman hunched over a washtub with bleeding knuckles, or sewing by candlelight while a pot boils over in the corner. Her day began in darkness. Winter mornings meant lighting the fire before the frost bit the children's fingers. In summer, the air was already heavy with heat before she stepped outside. First came the fire. No fire meant no cooking, no warmth, and no survival. Water had to be hauled, sometimes a mile or more. Breakfast was whatever could be scraped together. Eggs if they had hens, bread if they had flour, hot water if they had nothing. She ate last. Laundry was an all-day punishment: hauling, scrubbing, wringing, and hanging in whatever weather came. Winter froze clothes, stiff as boards. Summer turned them sour with sweat and smoke. Then came mending, patching shirts, knitting socks, repairing harnesses. A tear left alone meant going without. Livestock added more work: feeding chickens, milking cows, mucking stalls, guarding against foxes or wolves. If a predator got through, she was the one who dealt with it, rifle or shovel in hand. Meals, again, were her responsibility. And if anyone fell sick, she became a nurse, doctor, and undertaker. When someone died, she was often the one to wash the body, dress it, and lay it out for burial. This was all women's work: constant, necessary, and invisible. Men were celebrated for hunting or breaking horses. Women who turned that meat into food or kept the animals alive long enough to breed were simply doing their duty. The frontier may have been tamed with grit, but it was held together with the unending labor of women who worked themselves down to the bone for no glory, and often for no thanks. Violence in the home. No one to protect you. On the frontier, danger didn't always come from outlaws, drifters, or wild animals. Sometimes, it came from across the dinner table. Domestic violence wasn't rare. It was woven into daily life, hidden in plain sight. A husband's discipline was considered a private matter. Neighbors might hear the shouting, the crash of furniture, the thud of a fist. but they seldom intervened. The law offered no refuge. In many territories, a man was allowed to strike his wife as long as he didn't cause permanent injury. If a woman reported abuse, she risked humiliation, retaliation, or both. Authorities might dismiss her, or worse, tell her husband she had complained. Leaving was dangerous. Alone, she was vulnerable to hunger, assault, or simply disappearing. Many women stayed not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was worse. Children grew up breathing this violence. Boys learned that power came from force. Girls learned to endure. The pattern passed from one generation to the next. Some women fought back quietly and at great risk. There were whispers of wives who laced coffee with poison, who vanished under the cover of darkness, who picked up axes when the blows came too close. But such acts made them fugitives, not heroes. Others simply endured. They hid bruises beneath sleeves in silence. They learned to keep their heads down, their voices soft, and their hope small. Meanwhile, popular stories romanticized the rugged frontiersman as noble and brave. But the women who cooked for him, mended his wounds, and absorbed his rage rarely made it into the legend. For many, the most dangerous place in the Wild West wasn't a saloon or a gunfight, it was their own home, and no one was coming to save them. The Wild West didn't have much in the way of law. That's part of what made it wild. But for women, that meant living under a system where justice was more rumor than reality. Courthouses were few and far between. Judges were often corrupt or biased. Sheriffs could be bought. And juries, when they existed, were made up entirely of men. There were no women on the bench, no women in law enforcement, and definitely no laws written with a woman's safety in mind. If you were a man in the West and you committed a crime, you might be arrested if someone bothered. If you were a woman and you were the victim of a crime, good luck. Rape, for instance, was almost never prosecuted. Even when there was clear evidence, the victim was blamed. What was she wearing? Was she drinking? Why was she alone with a man? The unspoken rule was simple. If a woman got hurt, she must have done something to deserve it. And if she couldn't prove otherwise to a jury of male peers, the case was thrown out or never heard at all. And let's talk about property laws. In many territories, a woman didn't even own the land she worked or the house she cleaned. Her husband did. If she was widowed, she might inherit. But if she remarried, it all transferred to the new husband. A woman who tried to live independently could be denied credit, denied ownership, even denied the right to sign contracts. Even widows weren't safe. Claim jumpers, greedy relatives, and predatory businessmen circled like vultures. Some used forged papers. Others used threats. A few used outright violence. And the law rarely intervened. Divorce? That was nearly impossible. A man could leave his wife, take the kids, take the land, and vanish, and no one would stop him. A woman who left her husband, on the other hand, was shamed, cast out, or branded immoral. Many stayed in terrible marriages because the law offered them nothing else. Sometimes the law turned on women completely. If a woman defended herself against an abusive partner and killed him, she was labeled a murderer. The courts didn't ask what he did to her. They asked why she didn't suffer in silence. And then there were the brothels, technically illegal in some places, but too profitable to shut down. Madams paid off sheriffs, and clients included judges, lawmakers, even clergy. Women who worked in these establishments were seen as disposable. If one was killed, the investigation rarely went beyond a shrug. In short, the law didn't protect women in the Wild West. It ignored them, exploited them, and sometimes turned them into examples. The justice system was a cracked facade over a lawless land, and women, especially poor women, indigenous women, and black women, fell through the cracks every day. Lone women, the danger of being independent. Being a woman in the Wild West was hard. Being a woman alone? That was a different kind of peril altogether. There were many reasons a woman might find herself on her own. Maybe her husband died, kicked by a horse. shot in a dispute, or taken by fever. Maybe she never married to begin with. Maybe she left a bad situation, or maybe she was cast out for not following someone else's rules. Whatever the reason, a lone woman on the frontier stood out. And not in a good way. She had no man to speak for her, which, in that time, meant no protection in court, no bargaining power with landowners, and no defense if someone decided to test her boundaries. She might own a small patch of land or try to run a business, but good luck keeping either without a man's name to back it. Predators, human ones, were quick to notice. Lone women were frequent targets for harassment, scams, and worse. A male neighbor might offer help, expecting something in return. Others assumed that any woman without a man must be available. Some showed up with marriage proposals. Others showed up with ropes and knives. And even when they weren't in danger, lone women were rarely left alone. Gossip followed them. Respectable society, what little of it there was, looked down on them. Church ladies whispered. Men stared. Every choice was questioned. Was she too independent? Too forward? Too proud? Some women tried to blend in, dressed modestly, spoke quietly, avoided conflict. Others leaned into it. They learned to shoot, worked harder than any man, built cabins with their own hands, chopped their own firewood, hunted their own meat. A few even dressed as men to avoid trouble. But the toll was enormous. Isolation, fear, exhaustion, loneliness that gnawed at the bones. There were exceptions, of course. Some women managed to carve out lives for themselves. Homesteaders, shopkeepers, teachers. A few even thrived. But it was always uphill, always dangerous, and always subject to being taken away with a single accusation or act of violence. And then there were the women who didn't make it into the history books at all, who were found dead on the side of the trail, who vanished during long winters, who were buried in unmarked graves with no one to remember their names. The West wasn't kind to anyone, but for women without a man beside them, it was often a gauntlet of suspicion, exploitation, and survival. To be independent was to be a target, and the cost of freedom for women in the Wild West was often everything. Mail-order brides. Desperation in a dress. Imagine packing your entire life into a small suitcase, boarding a train bound for a place you've never seen, to marry a man you've never met, all because you had no better options. That was the reality for thousands of women who became mail-order brides in the Wild West. At first glance, it might sound romantic. Lonely frontier men writing letters, lonely women answering them. Love blossoming by post. But peel back the sentimental layers, and you find a system fueled by desperation and inequality. Many of these women came from the East Coast or Europe, where overcrowding, poverty, and few job opportunities left them cornered. A factory girl in New York might work 16-hour days for pennies. A widow in Liverpool might face starvation. So, when an ad promised a fresh start, with a hard-working rancher in Montana or a merchant in Kansas, it sounded like hope. But hope didn't always match reality. The men placing these ads weren't screened. Some were kind and just wanted a partner. Others were violent, alcoholic, or simply looking for a servant they could legally control. There were stories, plenty of them, of women arriving and finding that the house was a shack, the man twice her age, and that marriage meant a lifetime of isolation and obedience. And there was no going back. Once she got off that train, she was stuck. Her family was far away. She often had no money of her own. Her letters might never reach home. Some were pressured into marriage within days of arrival. Others were coerced or outright threatened into staying. A few brave ones ran away. Most stayed. Mail-order brides had no legal protection. If they were beaten, the sheriff didn't care. If they were cheated on, the preacher told them to be more obedient. If they were raped by their husbands, it wasn't even considered a crime. And yet, they were expected to work, cook, clean, tend to livestock, raise children, care for aging in-laws, all while isolated from the rest of the world. Some adapted, some hardened. Some found ways to thrive, but many suffered in silence. The advertisements had made it sound like adventure, like destiny. In reality, it was a gamble. And for too many women, the cost was their freedom, their safety, or their sanity. What's more, society saw them as lucky. These women were provided for. They weren't living in tenements or brothels. But a different kind of prison isn't freedom. It's just another set of bars. The mail-order bride system may have brought bodies westward, but it also brought countless broken dreams. Behind every carefully inked letter and sepia-toned wedding photo was a woman who made an impossible choice and lived with the consequences for the rest of her life. Childbirth on the frontier, birth without mercy. There was no scream quite like a woman's scream in childbirth, especially out on the frontier, where there were no doctors nearby, no hospitals, and often no one to help at all. In the Wild West, childbirth wasn't a moment of celebration. It was a gamble. A gamble many women didn't survive. Medical care was practically non-existent. If you were lucky, a midwife might be nearby, someone with experience, passed down knowledge, and steady hands. But in many remote settlements, there wasn't even that. A neighbor, a sister, maybe your husband, who knew nothing and feared everything. And if the birth went wrong, there was little to do but pray. Pain relief was a fantasy. Ether was rare. Chloroform, when available, was dangerous and often misused. Most women gave birth on dirt floors, in cramped cabins, with no antiseptic, no clean towels, and no guarantee of survival. The leading causes of maternal death weren't mysterious. Infection, hemorrhaging, obstructed labor, things we can easily prevent today, were death sentences then. One misstep, one unwashed hand, one baby turned the wrong way. That's all it took. The statistics are horrifying. In some parts of the frontier, 1 in 5 women died from childbirth-related complications. And for every woman who died, there were many more who were permanently injured, torn, crippled, or incontinent for the rest of their lives. These injuries were rarely talked about, but they were everywhere. Quiet suffering, quiet shame. And what about the babies? Infant mortality was just as high. Even if the birth itself went smoothly, infection, malnutrition, or a cold winter night could still take a newborn before the week was out. Many women buried more children than they raised. And still, they kept going because they had to. Because birth control was nearly non-existent, and abstaining wasn't always a choice. Many frontier women gave birth to 10, 12, even 15 children over their lifetime. Each birth carried the same risks. Each one could be the last. There were no maternity leaves, no recovery periods. Within days, sometimes hours, a woman might be back on her feet, hauling water, cooking meals, nursing the new baby, while keeping toddlers out of the fire. Fevered, bleeding, exhausted, she was expected to push through. If she was lucky, she had a husband who helped, but many didn't. And even the kind ones couldn't stop the forces of nature or the crushing demands of frontier survival. Stillbirths were common, so were unmarked graves. Sometimes, the mother and child were buried together. 2 lives lost in one night. One grave dug in frozen soil. And after the burial, life went on. The chores didn't stop. The other children still needed to eat. And yet, despite the danger, childbirth was often the only way for a woman to feel her life had purpose. She wasn't just a wife or a helper. She was a mother. And motherhood, in many ways, was the only form of power society gave her. Some women became known for their strength in labor legends in their own communities. Others passed down birth knowledge through generations, becoming midwives themselves. They developed rituals, healing tinctures, and crude methods of care. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Still, the fear never left. Women whispered stories to one another of the girl down the road who bled out after her fourth baby, of the mother who went mad with infection, of the baby born blue and limp, wrapped in linens and never named. Childbirth wasn't just a biological event. It was a test of faith, of will, of endurance. It was the edge between life and death, and everyone knew it. So when we imagine the frontier, with its saloons and shootouts and cattle drives, we must also remember the quiet cabins lit by firelight, where women clenched their jaws, screamed into the night, and brought life into a brutal world with nothing but their own courage. Because for every outlaw and gunslinger who made the history books, there were thousands of women who braved something far more dangerous. And they did it alone, in the dark, with no doctor coming, and no help on the way. Widows, wages, and survival life after loss. The West was full of widows. You could hear their stories in the silence of empty cabins, see it in their eyes at the trading post, or smell it on the dusty clothes they no longer had time to wash. Death came fast, and often by disease, accident, childbirth, or bullet. And when it came, women were left to pick up the pieces, if they could. Being a widow in the Wild West didn't just mean grief. It meant danger. It meant poverty. It meant vulnerability at every turn. Without a husband, a woman lost her primary means of survival. There was no pension, no life insurance, no social safety net. What you had was what you could carry, trade, or protect. Some women inherited land or property, but that was rare and often contested. The law was patchy and rarely on a woman's side. A neighbor might try to claim her husband's cattle. A brother-in-law might show up demanding the homestead. If she didn't have male relatives to back her, she could easily lose everything. And yet, the West had no time for mourning. If there were children, they still needed to eat. The animals still needed to be fed. Firewood still had to be chopped. So she got up the next day and worked. And the next, and the next. Grief was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. Work for widows was scarce and backbreaking. A few found domestic work in town, scrubbing floors or taking in laundry for pennies. Others sold eggs or garden-produced barely enough to get by. Some ran boarding houses or took in lodgers, though that came with its own risks. And some turned to far darker options: saloon work, prostitution, or informal arrangements with men who offered protection in exchange for companionship. None of these were easy paths. All carried judgment. A respectable widow who took in a male tenant might find herself whispered about. A woman seen spending too much time at the bar might be labeled ruined. But survival didn't care about respectability. Hunger drowned out shame. Some widows remarried quickly, not always for love, but for stability. A neighboring rancher, a local merchant. Sometimes a much older man needed a housekeeper more than a partner. These marriages were transactions, not dreams. But they kept women housed, clothed, and protected from the worst. Others chose not to remarry. And those women, the ones who went it alone, became legends in their own right. They were tough, sharp, and unafraid to load a shotgun. They wore trousers. They cursed like cowboys. They ran their own land, raised their own kids, and dared anyone to cross them. Some towns came to respect them. Others feared them. But no one could ignore them. Still, for every independent widow who defied the odds, there were countless more who simply faded into hardship. Some lost children to malnutrition or fever. Some ended up homeless, moving from camp to camp, begging for work. Some took their own lives. Others drank themselves into numbness. And behind each face was a story. A lost love, a brutal winter, a promise unkept. The Wild West didn't pause for their pain, but we should. Because in those lonely graves, marked with nothing but a wooden cross, or in the corners of dusty photo albums, are the women who kept going when everything fell apart, who survived after survival seemed impossible. Their resilience wasn't glamorous. It wasn't written into dime novels or praised in the papers, but it was there, in every stitch they sewed, every mouth they fed, every acre they managed, without help. They were widows, yes, but they were also warriors. And if you want to know what strength looked like in the American frontier, don't look to the gunslingers. Look to the women who buried their husbands, dried their eyes, and kept on living. Because the West didn't just make men out of boys. It forged iron into the souls of women, schoolmarms and spinsters, educated, alone, and underpaid. She rode in alone, a trunk tied behind her saddle and a letter of appointment folded in her pocket. Dust caked her boots. The sun stung her eyes. Somewhere behind her, a train had pulled away. Ahead, a one-room schoolhouse stood waiting, battered by the wind. She was the new teacher, the schoolmarm, and the only educated woman for miles. In the Wild West, schoolmarms weren't just teachers. They were symbols of civilization, order, and hope. But they were also underpaid, overworked, and always under scrutiny. Usually unmarried and often barely in their 20s, these women took jobs most men refused, for wages that were barely livable. Imagine teaching in a room filled with boys twice your size, some older than you, some barely clothed, many illiterate and unruly. You taught every subject to every grade, in one space, 5 days a week. You had to be strict, yet kind, educated, but not uppity, firm, but feminine. And you had to be moral, always. Any hint of impropriety, real or imagined, could cost you your position. If you were seen alone with a man, rumors spread. If your skirt was too short, your job was threatened. School districts expected perfection and paid pennies for it. Many schoolmarms earned less than male teachers, sometimes half as much for the same work. Some of these women were motivated by purpose. They believed in the power of education. They wanted to uplift the frontier. Others simply needed the money. It was one of the few respectable jobs open to a single woman, and even then, most contracts required you to remain unmarried, get hitched, and you are out. So many schoolmarms stayed single, some by choice, others because frontier life left them with few options. If they didn't marry a local farmer, a lonely sheriff, or a miner, there were no men to choose from. And often, they didn't want to. They had dreams, ambitions, books to read, letters to write. They were labeled spinsters, but many were simply women who refused to shrink themselves. Still, the isolation was real. Teaching in remote towns meant living alone, often boarding with families, or staying in cold, drafty rooms above saloons or churches. Some walked miles to school each day. Others lived right inside the schoolhouse, cooking their meals on the same stove that warmed their students. And their work never ended. After the children left, there were papers to mark, lessons to prepare, firewood to haul. Sometimes they even acted as nurses, mediators, or caretakers when students fell ill. And if a blizzard swept through or a parent didn't show, it was the schoolmarm who stayed behind with frightened children. Despite their contributions, schoolmarms were constantly reminded of their place. They were to be educated, but not opinionated, gentle, but not weak, attractive, but not seductive. It was a tightrope walk of expectations that left many women exhausted and undervalued. Still, they endured. They brought Shakespeare to the prairie. They taught fractions in mining towns. They planted seeds of literacy in the children of farmers, blacksmiths, prostitutes, and cowhands alike. Their blackboards were cracked. Their chalk was broken, but their voices rang out, strong and steady. In time, some moved on. A few became writers or lecturers. Others married and faded into domestic life. But many stayed aging in place, becoming part of the towns they once entered as strangers. They were remembered fondly or forgotten entirely, but the towns themselves owed them everything, because without these women, the West would have remained a wilderness of ignorance. They brought more than knowledge. They brought structure, discipline, and the first sparks of aspiration. They gave children a future. They reminded towns of decency. And they did it for pennies and respect that came too late. So the next time someone tells you about the brave men who tamed the frontier, ask them about the women who opened its books, who lit its lamps, who read its first poems to boys with dirty hands and wandering hearts. Ask them about the schoolmarm, riding alone into a wild place, holding the line with nothing but a chalkboard and a spine of steel. Behind the bar, and under the glare saloon girls and the realities of survival, the doors swing open with a clatter. Smoke hangs in the air like judgment. Laughter, loud and drunken, erupts from a table near the back. A piano stumbles through a ragged tune. And there, at the edge of it all, she stands corset tight, smile painted, eyes sharp, the saloon girl. Not quite a prostitute, not quite a waitress, somewhere in between, balancing drinks, expectations, and her own fragile sense of safety. She was a fixture of the Wild West, a symbol of vice, beauty, and grit. And her life was anything but glamorous. Saloon girls weren't just entertainers, they were survivalists. Many had fled poverty, bad marriages, or worse back east. Some had been orphaned, abandoned, or tricked into traveling west with promises of marriage or work. When those promises broke, the saloon was often the last place left. At first glance, their job seemed simple. Pour drinks, flirt a little, maybe dance. But the truth was more complicated. These women worked long hours in hostile environments. Drunken fights broke out regularly. Customers groped, harassed, and occasionally became violent. And the saloon keeper? He might be just as dangerous. Some saloon girls were on the payroll, earning a small wage and keeping a portion of drink sales. Others had to rent their dresses from the house and pay for room and board, often ending the month in debt. The pretty smile wasn't just for fun. It was a strategy. It meant tips, and tips meant eating. Then there were the whispers. Soiled dove, painted lady. Even when they weren't sleeping with clients, the stigma clung to them. Respectable women wouldn't befriend them. Married women crossed the street to avoid them. And yet, these girls had to maintain the illusion of confidence, of desire, of flirtation. But behind the rouge and silk were stories. Many were barely 20. Some were mothers, hiding children in nearby boarding houses. Some drank to forget. Others saved every penny, dreaming of a boarding school, a farm, or a train ticket back east. A few succeeded. Many didn't. Violence was a constant shadow, a jealous customer, a controlling madam, a disease that came silently and never left. Some saloon girls transitioned to prostitution out of desperation. Others refused and were fired. The choices were rarely real. They were illusions wrapped in survival. Yet, despite all this, saloon girls formed their own networks. They looked out for one another. They warned newcomers of dangerous men. They shared makeup, meals, and sometimes escape plans. In a world where few cared if they lived or died, these women became each other's lifelines. Some even found love genuine, unlikely, and hard-won. A quiet ranch hand, a sympathetic sheriff. These stories were rare but real. And when they married, many tried to erase their past. They changed their names, moved towns. I hoped the past wouldn't follow. But for most, the saloon wasn't a stepping stone. It was a trap. One drink too many. One bad customer. One cold night with no coal. And the line between entertainer and exploitation vanished completely. Still, they endured. They smiled through the pain. They danced until their feet bled. They memorized every regular's name, story, and preferred drink. And at the end of the night, when the piano stopped and the lights dimmed, They washed off the rogue and stared into cracked mirrors, trying to remember who they were underneath it all. They were survivors, not seductresses. Women caught in a brutal system, doing what they had to do to stay afloat in a town that gave them no other options. So, the next time a Western film pans across a saloon, offering a cheeky wink at the girls of the bar, remember this: behind every flirtatious grin was a story of resilience, sorrow, and strength. These weren't side characters in someone else's adventure. They were the heart of the West's hidden history. The Wild West didn't just chew up outlaws and cattle rustlers. It chewed up women, especially the ones forced to smile through it. Motherhood on the frontier, childbirth, loss, and the labor of love. The log cabin was quiet, but not in peace. It was the hush that followed a scream. A midwife, if one could be found, worked by lamplight, sleeves rolled, hands trembling but sure. A man waited outside, pacing or praying, or both. Inside, a woman labored not just to give birth, but to survive it. Motherhood in the Wild West was not a soft cradle and lullabies. It was pain, blood, and hope twisted together. For many women, childbirth was the most dangerous part of their lives, and one of the most constant. Families were large, often out of necessity. Children meant help on the farm, someone to carry on the work, and in the cruelest of terms, replacements for the ones who might not survive. Imagine giving birth in a cabin with dirt floors and no doctor for miles, no sterile instruments, no anesthesia. Just boiling water, rough linens, and whatever knowledge the attending woman had inherited from her own mother. Pain relief was often non-existent. Maybe a cloth to bite down on, or whiskey, if you were lucky. And the risks were immense. Hemorrhage, infection, breech births, stillbirths. In the West, maternal death was a fact of life. Yet women faced it again and again. Some bore 10, 12, 15 children. Some lost half to fever, accident, or cold. There were no guarantees. A bad winter could take the child. A faulty delivery could take the mother. And after the birth, there was no rest. The baby needed milk. The other children needed supper. The livestock needed feeding. Still, women created rituals of care where they could. They used herbs, raspberry leaf for strength, comfrey for pain, lavender for calm. They told each other stories of safe births and miracle babies. They wrapped infants in handmade blankets, sang softly, and hoped the fever wouldn't come. And if it did, if the child weakened, cried nonstop, or turned cold, there were no hospitals, no pediatricians, just prayers, poultices, and dread. Many mothers buried more children than they raised. They made tiny coffins, dug shallow graves, wept in silence because tears wouldn't milk the cow or mend the clothes. For women of color and indigenous mothers, things were even worse. Access to help was even more limited. Some relied on traditional knowledge passed down in tribes or among enslaved and formerly enslaved women. Others were entirely on their own, forced to navigate birth and grief without support, all while enduring systemic violence or displacement. Despite everything, mothers were often the emotional and practical centers of their families. They taught children to read, stitched their clothes, prepared meals, and nursed both wounds and pride. They were often the only source of comfort in a world that did not make space for softness. And still, they were expected to do it all without complaint. Rarely was there recognition of the cost: physical, emotional, spiritual. A woman who struggled was told to be strong. A woman who cried was hysterical. There was no room for postpartum depression, no language for the invisible weight so many carried. You were expected to return to chores within days of birth, hauling water, wringing laundry, baking bread, baby on your hip, grief tucked behind your apron. Some women turned to journals, recording their lives in terse, powerful lines. Others stitched names into quilts, living and lost. These fragments, found in attics and trunks, tell us what history books often ignore: that motherhood was a battlefield. And most of the time, no one came back unscarred. But there was joy, too. The first cry of a healthy baby. The moment a toddler took their first step on a packed dirt floor. The rare luxury of a quiet morning, sunlight pouring in through a handmade curtain, baby asleep on your chest. In those fleeting moments, the world softened, just a little. Motherhood in the West was not romantic. It was raw, and it was real. It demanded everything, and often gave nothing back. Yet countless women stepped into it with courage that should not be forgotten. They birthed a nation in silence, and they buried half of it too. Broken promises, mail-order brides, and the peril of escape. The envelope arrived, sealed with hope and desperation. A photograph tucked inside, perhaps stained with dust or perfume. Carefully chosen words scratched out in careful penmanship. A good home, land of my own, in need of a wife. I'll provide. I'm kind. For many women in the 19th century, those words were a lifeline. A way out of poverty, spinsterhood, or a life working in a factory or someone else's kitchen. The mail-order bride system, as strange as it seems now, was once seen as a chance at salvation. But often, that salvation turned out to be another form of imprisonment. The practice gained popularity after the Homestead Act of 1862, which encouraged settlement in the West by giving away land mostly to men. These men needed wives, both for companionship and survival. Life on a farm or ranch was tough. Cooking, cleaning, raising children, and tending animals were all expected of a frontier wife. But there were far fewer women than men west of the Mississippi, which meant many turned to matchmaking services, classified ads, or newspapers to find one. The advertisements were often vague. Men described themselves as God-fearing, industrious, or financially stable. A photograph, sometimes years out of date, might be included. Women, often in desperate straits, responded with letters and hope. Some were widows. Others had no family. A few were simply seeking adventure, romance, or the chance to own something, anything, of their own. But the promise of a better life didn't always align with reality. The journey west was brutal. Women traveled by train, coach, or even wagon, sometimes for weeks. Many arrived to find that their future husbands were older than advertised, or cruel, or dirty, or already drinking their way through hard times. Some had no house, just a shack. Others had children from previous marriages they hadn't mentioned. And once a woman arrived, leaving wasn't simple. In most cases, she had no money, no family nearby, and no legal power. Some mail-order brides found themselves in abusive relationships. Others were forced into hard labor from dawn to dusk, their only romance the chores they shared with their new husbands. A few were outright lied to, tricked into situations more akin to indentured servitude than marriage. Divorce was rare and stigmatized. A woman seeking to escape often had nowhere to go. If she ran, she might end up in a worse situation in a brothel, in poverty, or worse, lost in unfamiliar wilderness with no support. Despite the risks, some mail-order marriages did succeed. There are accounts of couples who built lives together from nothing, who came to love one another through shared hardship and quiet strength. But for every success story, there were dozens more marked by disappointment or danger. The irony was bitter. A woman might flee a crowded, stifling life in a textile mill or boarding house, only to end up working harder, with fewer rights and more isolation than ever before. And still, society expected her to be grateful. Many mail-order brides wrote back east to warn others. Some were published in women's columns or passed hand to hand like warnings. He drinks. He lies. He beats me. Others remained silent, their lives swallowed by the dust and distance. There were no romantic endings for many of these women. No rescue, no riding off into the sunset. Only long days, heavy laundry, unending chores, and the cold prairie wind blowing through the cracks in the walls of a house they never really chose. And yet, they endured. Some raised children who would go on to build towns and communities. Others became midwives, teachers, or pillars of their churches. Their resilience wasn't born from love. It was born from necessity. The story of mail-order brides isn't a love story. It's a story of compromise, of survival, and of how easily a woman's dreams could be bartered away with a single letter. Because in the Wild West, a woman's choices weren't about what she wanted. They were about what she could endure. Crimes of survival outlaws, theft, and the women who had no other choice. The sheriff didn't ask why she did it. He just looked at the loaf of bread in her hands and the child clinging to her skirt. The law was clear. Theft was theft, even if your baby hadn't eaten in 2 days. In the Wild West, survival often clashed with morality. For women, that clash was especially brutal. With limited legal rights, no access to property or stable income, and few jobs beyond the domestic sphere, some women were forced to choose between obeying the law and feeding their children. So they stole. They stole food, firewood, and shoes. Sometimes they stole horses out of desperation or revenge. Others lied about their identities to escape debts or abusive husbands. A few even became outlaws, riding with gangs or operating cons in saloons. Their stories didn't make dime novels, but they were real, and they reveal the harsh truth. Crime was often the only option left for women on the edge of survival. Take Belle Siddons, for instance, a Confederate nurse who, after the war, turned to gambling and cons under the name Madame Vestal. She wasn't robbing banks with dynamite, but she was bending a system never made for her. Or Pearl Hart, who dressed as a man to rob stagecoaches and later explained, "I shall not be tried by a jury of my peers because I have no peers." Her crime wasn't just theft. It was being a woman who refused to starve quietly. These women weren't villains in the traditional sense. They were pushed to extremes. Sometimes they broke the law to escape forced marriages. Sometimes they fled abusive homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. When laws only protected landowners who were usually men, where could a woman turn for justice? Even small crimes carried big consequences. A woman caught stealing could be fined more than she could ever repay. If she couldn't pay, she might be imprisoned, or worse, thrown into a makeshift jail where conditions were filthy and violent. Pregnant women gave birth behind bars. Mothers were separated from their children. In some towns, a woman could be publicly whipped or branded for her crimes, her body turned into a warning sign for others. And yet, the system that punished them never asked what drove them to steal. For some, petty theft was the first step down a darker path. A woman accused of stealing once might find herself blacklisted, unemployable, and forced to turn to sex work to survive. The shame followed her. Towns whispered. Employers looked away. Churches shut their doors. But not all stories end in despair. Some women formed loose networks of support. They warned each other about dangerous employers. They shared food or shelter. In some towns, sympathetic neighbors would lie to protect a woman who'd stolen a sack of flour or forged a signature. Quiet defiance, silent solidarity. Still, it was rare. Most women endured alone. Branded as criminals not because they were heartless, but because they were hungry. In the Wild West, there were no safety nets, only survival. And the justice system made no room for context. Women were judged quickly. There was no space for their stories. A widow who'd lost her land in a fire? Still a thief. A runaway from a violent home? Still a fugitive. The law was blind, but not in a fair way. It was blind to the humanity of women trying to live through impossible circumstances. And then there were those who truly turned outlaw, not out of desperation, but defiance. They carried guns, rode horses, held up trains, but they were rare. Most criminal women weren't bandits. They were laundresses who skimmed coins from their boss. They were nannies who took a crust of bread. They were women who didn't want to die quietly in a world that demanded obedience above all else. Their stories have largely been forgotten not because they weren't important, but because they were inconvenient. They remind us that crime isn't always greed. Sometimes it's just survival. And in the lawless edges of the West, survival was the only justice most women ever knew. The Silent West, forgotten women, and erased voices. She was there when the town was built, hands blistered from hauling water, skin burnt from prairie sun. She nursed children, buried friends, stitched dresses and wounds alike. But when the history books were written, her name was left out. The Wild West has always been loud. Gunsmoke, galloping hooves, dynamite, and whiskey-fueled brawls. But for women, it was also deeply silent. Their stories of endurance, loss, strength, and survival were often ignored, their voices drowned out by myths of cowboys and lawmen. The erasure was not accidental. In fact, it was convenient. Frontier women were expected to be invisible unless they conformed. The respectable wife archetype, quiet, dutiful, always in the shadow of her husband, fit the narrative. But those who didn't fit? The saloon girls, the thieves, the single mothers, the midwives with herbal remedies, the indigenous wives of fur trappers, they vanished from the official record. The men wrote the history, and they chose what to remember. Take the diaries of frontier women, hundreds of them. Most were never published. Some were burned by descendants who found the content too raw, too painful, or too scandalous. Others lie in archives, unopened, dismissed as domestic and unimportant. But those pages tell a different story, of childbirth in cabins, of watching husbands die in stampedes, of fighting off wolves and loneliness. They also tell of love brief, desperate, and sometimes tragic, of letters never received, of weddings that doubled as business deals, of lovers who vanished with the sunrise, leaving only a whisper of perfume and a broken promise. The silence extended beyond white women too. Black women, many formerly enslaved, moved west in search of freedom, but found themselves restricted to the lowest paying, most grueling jobs. Their stories were erased twice, once by racism, and again by the myth of a white, rugged West. Indigenous women fared worse. They were kidnapped, trafficked, murdered, and rarely mourned outside their own communities. Their languages, customs, and stories were violently silenced, even as their labor and knowledge were exploited. Even educated women school teachers, newspaper columnists, or ranch owners faced censorship. A woman who spoke too loudly was hysterical. One who challenged a man's claim was ungrateful. To be remembered, women had to behave, and behaving often meant disappearing. Yet, in their silence, they still shaped the West. It was women who held communities together. They formed the first schools, ran the churches, and organized the aid societies that fed the hungry and buried the dead. They cooked the meals, patched the roofs, wrote the letters, and read the laws, even if those laws didn't recognize them. Their labor made settlements livable. Their compassion made them survivable. Some did leave traces, faded photographs, baptismal records, names scratched on the backs of family Bibles. But often, even those clues are fragmented. A woman might appear as Mrs. John Miller in a census and nowhere else. Her identity reduced to a man's name. Her life boxed into a blank square. That's why telling these stories matters. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're real. Not every woman was a gunslinger or a brothel madam. Most were tired, overworked, resilient, and forgotten. They lived and died in towns that don't exist anymore. They raised children who became sheriffs and senators. And yet, they were written out of the frame. The Wild West we're talking about was never the whole picture. The saloons, the duels, the cattle drives, those were just the loud parts. The real West had women kneeling by wood stoves, teaching children under leaking roofs, bargaining at markets, and walking alone down empty dirt roads. They weren't background characters. They were the foundation. So when you imagine the frontier, don't just picture the man with a revolver and a dusty hat. Picture the woman at the window, watching the sun dip behind the plains, wondering if her husband would come back. Picture the girl hiding a stolen newspaper under her apron, learning to read in secret. Picture the midwife with blood on her hands, whispering prayers as a mother screams through labor. Picture the woman standing by the grave of her fourth child, alone in a world that barely knew her name. Their voices may have been silenced, but they were never absent. They were always there. And there you have it. Behind the myths of six-shooters, saloons, and dusty duels lies a harsher, quieter truth. The story of women who endured the Wild West. Their lives were rarely glamorous, never easy, and often erased. But they were real. They fought to survive in a world stacked against them, where the law offered little protection and even less freedom. These women weren't just background characters in someone else's legend. They were the backbone of frontier life. Farmers, mothers, midwives, rebels, outlaws, caretakers, survivors. Every cabin raised, every child delivered, every town built, carried their invisible fingerprints. If this journey into the untold stories of frontier women gave you a new perspective or even made you stop and think, stick around, because history isn't just kings and cowboys. It's the everyday people who lived it, bled for it, and kept going anyway. Thanks for watching. And remember, the West wasn't won by men alone. It was survived by women.